Good morning. My name is Fabiana Mello. I'm the CFO for the Lincoln Park. Today you'll be hearing a presentation from Gabriela Simões. Gabriela is the Chief Financial Officer for the town of Harrison since 2010. She earned a BA in Business Administration from City Hall and a BA from Montclair State University. Gabriela is the treasurer for the Harrison Board of Education, as well as Harrison's Redevelopment Agency. She's the treasurer for the Harrison Education Foundation, Queen Peace of Alumni Association, and the executive board of the Government Finance Officers Association for New Jersey. Prior to becoming CFO in Harrison, Gabriela worked as forensic and financial analysis for near 10 years, specialized in financial economics analysis and litigation support. She participated in wages loss report compilations for 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund, and also co-authored several publications in the New Jersey Lawyer and Valuations Examiners. At this time, please turn your cell phones off. We're going to hear from Gabriela.
Good morning, everyone. I want to start off by thanking the Fall Conference Committee for putting together a great conference. The sessions have been extremely informative, and the networking has been wonderful. So I really want to express my appreciation. And I also want to say that I'm so excited to be part of the GFOA as an organization. They've done some wonderful things like the Women's Conference last year and the Fall Conference Committee, so I'm really excited to be a part of the organization. I also want to say that I'm humbled because I know that there are a lot of seasoned CFOs in the crowd that have done and have been a part of contract negotiations for far longer than I have been. So I appreciate the fact that you're giving me this platform to talk about this subject. I also want to give a little bit of perspective. So my career with my municipality is just coming on 7 years, and where we started is far different from where we are right now. And that gives a little bit of perspective with respect to negotiations, because where I started was much more of a year-to-year survival and much more of a reactive place. And where we are now is much more of a proactive place and much more of a place where we are dealing with planning and with projecting. So when we started, we inherited our largest taxpayer was filing a tax appeal. And the interesting part was that it was actually based on an exemption status. And the loophole in the law is that when you're filing a tax appeal for exempt status, you don't have to keep your taxes current. So when we first walked in, we found out that our largest taxpayer was filing an appeal and they weren't paying their taxes. We also had our largest debt service payment come online on top of already a very large debt load that the municipality had. We had significant cash flow challenges, and we relied on tax flow borrowing, and we had just been downgraded terribly by the credit rating agencies, which means that we had very little access to the market for TANs, and when we did go to the market, we were paying significant amounts of money for the borrowing for 1 year. We were a transitional aid town, and so this year, amongst all the other things that happened, we had our TA significantly cut. And our reserves and our fund balance were depleted to $26,000 on a $40 million budget. So it was a tough year to start off in the field of being a certified a CFO in a municipality. But the good thing about it was that we had an amazing governing body, right? It wasn't any one thing that any one person did. It was kind of a perfect storm. And they really wanted to do the right thing, and they really respected the opinions of the professionals and what they spoke to them about as far as how we could do what we needed to do to get to a better place. And the second piece of it was being a transitional aid town is very difficult. You have a significant amount of oversight, and there is a lot of scrutiny. But you also develop this phenomenal relationship with the state. Because when you do that, and when you have a good relationship with your oversight officers, and you create a vision of where you want to be as a healthy municipality, they work with you, and they help you get the tools that you need to get there. A phenomenal staff to get there, and more importantly, I had an amazing mentor, which probably had a lot more patience than any one person should ever have, and that's Ron Angelo, so I was very fortunate to have him. But fast forward almost 7 years later, and baby steps pretty much got us to a place where we no longer rely on cash flow borrowing. We've had 6 upgrades in 6 years. We're no longer on transitional aid, and we settled Red Bull. But what that really means is that during my almost 7-year tenure, we've gone through 2 periods of contract negotiations. And the first time that there was a negotiating team, I had zero involvement because obviously our plate was full and we were dealing with a very reactive mind frame. So the negotiating team went in and they did what they had to do and they came back out and they told us, you know, your attorneys high five, we did a great job. We negotiated 1.5%, you know, figure it out, find out how we can pay for it. And I'm sure that many of you can sympathize with being in that position as far as what your role is in negotiations. So the second round of negotiations was very different. We no longer were looking at our budgets from year to year, but we've been putting together projections that are 3 and 5 years down, right? So we know what we can afford. And we've built great relationships with our counterparts professionally, and so now they want you to be a part of the negotiating team because they want to know what is it that we can afford, right? And so now that we're in this position, I want to go through some of the things that I personally dealt with when it came to negotiations. And I also want to talk to you about a couple of the tools and a couple of the things that are out there that help to create some leverage and really a shift in the culture when it comes to negotiating and how the results of those negotiations are actually being presented to our public and to our governing body. So first I'm going to get a little technical. And here's a couple important statistics. So 101 and 187 represents the number of petitions and open claims prior to January 1st of 2011 that were before binding interest arbitration. 20 and 17 are the number of petitions and open claims in 15 and 16, just a few short years later, for binding interest arbitration. And 1.73% and 1.71%. So there were about 15 arbitration awards in 2015, or cases that went before interest arbitration. 9 of them voluntarily settled before they were actually arbitrated, and 6 of them actually were arbitrated. And the effective percentage increase for those was just about 1.7%. And so I highlighted effective because it's really an important term as we go through this presentation. And so I get it, we've heard a lot of presentations. You might zone in and out while I'm talking to you. So there's like 3 key terms that I want you to take from this presentation. So if you kind of space out or you're checking an email and then you hear one of these words, just look up and listen because these are things that I think are going to help you. So the first thing is base salary. When you hear that word, look up because it is starting to have a different meaning when it comes to negotiations. The second word is ATB. It's an acronym for across the board. Listen when I say it because that's the distinction between what base salary used to be and what base salary is now. And then the third word that I'm going to bring up is employee compensation disclosure forms. It's a mouthful. I'm going to refer to it as ECs, and I think it's something that we're all going to become very familiar with in the near future. So back to the statistics before. Why was there an 80 and 90% reduction in petitions and open claims? And that's because there was a 2% cap that was placed on arbitration. And it was effective in 11, it was renewed in 2014, and it's set to sunset at the end of this year. Part of that 2% cap was that a task force was put in place to review everything that went to arbitration and what ultimately happened during arbitration, what were the results, was it effective, and what were the recommendations going forward. And there was a report issued in 14 and a report issued in 16. And the report in 14 analyzed, I believe it was 17 arbitration awards that went from the time the 2% cap was initiated in 11 and 14 when the report was issued. And they found that the average effective percentage increase was about 1.9%. They pulled a sample of those because they wanted to compare that to what happened in arbitration in the past. But they couldn't because in the past, all arbitration awards were always reported based on what the ATB raise was, right? So they negotiated a raise on the starting number of your salary guide, but they never actually figured out what the effective percentage increase was on the contracts as you started moving things through things like steps and longevity and other pieces that were compounded onto your base salary. And so what they did was they pulled 12 of those 17, a relevant sample, and they took all of the terms from the expiring year contract and they mapped it out through the new term that they were negotiating. They moved everybody on the steps and they moved everybody on longevity, and they found out that the average increase was just under 4.7%. So 4.7% versus 1.9% on our budgets is huge. Salaries and wages are one of our biggest line items, and we have a 2% cap. So it's a significant difference. And what they did was they highlighted the fact that dynamic status quo is obviously a big issue for municipalities. For those of you that are familiar with dynamic status quo, it's something that we deal with, and for those of you that aren't familiar, it's a doctrine that was established by PERC years ago because they didn't want undue pressure on the negotiating process, right? They didn't want people to have to rush to negotiate a contract and get it done, and so there was undue pressure on both sides. But what's happened is the continuation of steps and longevity are actually putting municipalities at a disadvantage. And recently, it was Bridgewater, and so you can stop Natasha and ask her about it when you see her outside, and I think Atlantic County, and they challenged this idea of dynamic status quo. And PERC agreed with them. They said, you're right, you have all these caps in place now, and so this dynamic status quo isn't feasible for municipalities. And then it was appealed by the unions, and at the appellate division, they won. And they said, no, PERC can't overturn what they did before. So they went forward and they went to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said, you have to continue it, but not necessarily because of PERC. They didn't even touch that. They said it's because of contract law, because the contracts were silent on it. So here's a note, while you're negotiating, and if you're in a year where you have more leverage, start talking about having your contract explicitly expire the year that it expires. Have it talk to having your steps and longevity end when that contract ends. And sometimes that's impossible to negotiate depending on your political climate or the morale with your departments, but sometimes when you have a little bit of leverage or you have a really good working relationship, you might get there. So keep that in mind when it comes to negotiating. So you're probably wondering, like, why does this matter, right? The 2% cap, hello, it's expiring potentially at the end of this year, and you're talking about it now, it's a few months away, it's not even relevant. But prior to the law, public employers, unions, and arbitrators would report the negotiated percentage raise. However, it never factored in the increases to salary costs that were caused by step or longevity payments. So that's huge. They weren't reporting effectively how much one contract was increasing over the next. The main point that matters is because now, with this 2% cap, by law, a definition was introduced into our negotiations for base salary. How many times have you gotten a request for how much is your, what are your salaries for this union, what are your salaries for that union, and you look at each other and you say, well, do we give it to them with longevity? Do we give it as a pensionable salary? Do we just give the base numbers off of the, your salary ordinance? And that pretty much is going away because there's a definition in front of you now that pretty much says your base salary is every single compounded number loaded into that salary that most likely results in your pensionable salary. So there's no longer a gray area in the interpretation of that number, and that culture is going to continue, even if the 2% cap does sunset and even if it doesn't continue. Across the board raises, or ATB raises, are typically what it is that you saw was being reported to your governing body and to the public and in arbitration awards. And so now there's a clear distinction between, are you awarding an ATB raise, and if somebody is telling you they're awarding an ATB raise, what is the effective percentage increase on your contract and ultimately on your budget? So the reason that this is even more important is because even if the 2% cap is sunsetting, there's a whole nother layer of reporting that we're going to have to be dealing soon with, and that's called an employee compensation disclosure form. Now, let's get a little technical. Employee compensation disclosure forms are an extended arm, in my opinion, of the 2% cap because they exemplify all of the terms that were in the 2% cap onto these forms. They follow the same definitions for base salary. The 2% cap, which I'm going to go through a little bit, the arbitration matrix and how it's calculated, requires that you present every single piece of your contract incrementally. And now these EC forms are doing the same exact thing. They're breaking down your base salary, what do your steps cost, what is your longevity cost, and ultimately, what is the effective increase in your contract for both economic and non-economic items that are built into your contract. So I just went through what they are. Statutorily, they're required to be filed. As CFOs, basically, where do we have to file them and how do we have to file them? Whenever there's a proposed resolution or any other action to modify salaries or any other compensation, a public meeting must be held. There needs to be publication at least 10 days before that meeting, and prior to the publication, you all as CFOs are going to be required to file these forms with your governing body, through your clerk or through the secretary of the governing body, and these forms are going to become part of your public record, and they are going to very clearly break out how much each component of your contract costs, and effectively what the percentage increase is, which people are much more in tune with considering we now have these 2% caps on our budget. So if you see that your contract is effectively 5% more than the prior contract, it's going to be looked at differently than that 1.75% ATB that was being reported beforehand. You're going to get a lot more scrutiny, and there's going to be a lot more downward pressure on the ability to accept a contract like that. Why are they relevant now? Well, PERC always had a summary contract form that was supposed to be submitted with the contracts after the fact. The contract's already negotiated, you said in the summary form. A lot of people may not have been sending in the summary form, but this is different. First of all, if there's governing body action without these forms, it's basically considered null and void. The contracts were never accepted. And they're relevant now because there's a proposed new rule, and you can see the reference there, and they've actually created these forms as an Appendix A and an Appendix B. It's for both contractually negotiated agreements and non-contractually negotiated agreements. So it covers anyone and everyone where there's salary movement. So right now you probably feel like this is information overload, right? You're talking about a 2% cap that expires. You're talking about an ECDF form. Like, where is she going with all this? And to me, I feel that the same way that my role in negotiations changed from when I started my career until where it is now, I'm seeing that there is a massive culture change in the way negotiations are happening across the board, from the way that they're being reported to the governing body, to the way that arbitrators are calculating them and viewing them, and to the way that we're actually talking about them in the room. Because what my experience was with this round of negotiations was that my unions looked at me and they said, we haven't gotten a raise yet. Well, you have longevity and steps. Oh, but that doesn't apply to me this year. Oh, but it costs a lot of money to the town, so it's still considered an increase on your contract. And that's a foreign opinion to most, but it's starting to become much more accepted and much more understood because we're able to put it in black and white in front of the unions. So with all this information, what you want to do as CFOs is you want to prepare accordingly. And how do you do that? So we were very fortunate to have 2 presentations yesterday on Excel. I'm excited about slicers and pivot tables and all these, I can't wait to put my spreadsheets together. But more importantly, you have to put your spreadsheets together where they're modeled after the arbitration matrix, because we don't know what's going to happen at the end of this year. It could potentially be extended. And the beauty of that is that your arbitration matrix is modeling the ECDF forms that we're going to have to eventually file. So when you create your spreadsheets in this way, you're killing 2 birds, 3 birds, 4 birds with 1 stone. You're doing the work that's preparing you for negotiations, but ultimately you're already creating the spreadsheets that are going to give you your inputs for your ECDF forms, and ultimately for your user-friendly budgets and all these other documents that we're required to file. You always want to break down your base salary to include, now this is an important point. The 2% cap very specifically identifies what makes up your base salary, what makes up your starting point where you can calculate your 2% bundle of cash that the arbitrator has to work with. You take the final year of your expired agreement, the last 12 months, you prorate retirements and new hires. That's how you handle those. You don't consider any breakage in your new contract term. If you know that there's going to be savings from highly paid retirees, or the inverse, that you're actually going to be spending money because of new hires or new budgeted positions, they are not considered in the arbitration matrix. They are not considered. Should it go to arbitration, it's not considered as part of the 2% base. You want to break out each individual line item, your salary, your longevity, your other costs that are all considered base salary, and ultimately that feed into your pensionable salary. You want to make it all formula driven. You want to check your spreadsheets, but you don't want to have to go in and manually put anything in. And ultimately your results are going to be incremental, which is what you need to fill out your ECDF forms. Other economic items are not considered for arbitration, but you still want them on your spreadsheet. You want to know your clothing allowance. You want to know your EMT stipends, or if you have some sort of sick leave incentive. Nobody takes a sick day, so they get $250 every 6 months. Anything at all that is built into that contract that has an impact on your budget should be broken down on the spreadsheet. So even though it's not relevant if you go to arbitration, it is so relevant on the EC forms. They want every single thing broken down, right down to what are your new Chapter 78 contributions. They want to know how much is the health insurance cost for this union and how much are they going to be contributing for the health insurance. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the categories you should include on your spreadsheet. How many of those should be inputs versus formulas? Which of those categories fall into that base salary definition? How many are considered other economic items that don't fall into the base salary formula? And obviously all of our contracts are different. So for example, in my municipality, our fire department is required to be EMT certified. So part of their contract is they get a 2% load on top of their starting salary guide number. And then that subtotal, which I can't stress this enough, you want a column for every single thing that you calculate. So I have my starting number, they get a 2% stipend on top of it, I have a subtotal. That's the base for my longevity. I calculate my longevity because your EC forms want to know what was your old longevity, what's your new longevity, how much more is it, what's the effective percentage increase. Break it all out. So here's a huge, no, not really, this is very consolidated. Chris's spreadsheet was huge. So this is basically going to illustrate the point that I'm making to you. The very top category is base year. That's the expiring year of your contract. You're going to list things like the name of the employee in the union, what their title or their rank is, what step they're on, their years of service, their longevity percentage, and then you basically want to break out anyone that's going to have movement during that year. And you're going to prorate that information. So you want to have a very specific number that you would go into arbitration with, but this is also the formula for the number that you're going to use on your EC forms, right? So if somebody had a step, conveniently everybody was hired January 1st on my spreadsheet, but we all know that's not realistic. So you're going to make sure that you prorate exactly when somebody has a promotion anniversary or a step or longevity or any of those changes. You're going to have your starting salary number. I consolidated a few things here, a 2% stipend. I have a longevity column, which is the sum of A and B times percentage, and then you have a subtotal. So there's your base salary, $1,056,789. So your starting negotiation, well, first of all, in arbitration, that becomes the number that you multiply by 2%. And if you're negotiating 3 years, you compound it. And that becomes your pool of cash that your arbitrator will work with. Now, the beauty of arbitration is that chances are they're going to completely rework your contract. They're going to freeze steps, or they're going to eliminate longevity or reduce some longevity. They're going to add steps so that there's smaller movements during the contract, all to fit within that 2% cap, which is the difference between, earlier on, that effective 1.9% versus that effective almost 5% in those contracts. So as you move down the line, there's dynamic status quo. You have less than half of your department moving on steps and longevity. And you run along the lines and you see that your starting salary number has increased by about $20,000. You had a small increase on your 2% stipend, which makes sense, it's 2% on $20,000. And then you have your longevity changes. And ultimately, your contract has gone up $29,000 or close to $30,000. And on that base salary number, you're at 2.83%. So you already blew through the 2% cap, and you haven't even negotiated a single thing. But now, when you walk into your negotiations, if you know that arbitration is a possibility, or if you know that you're going to be reporting effective percentage increases to your governing body and to the public, there's going to be a lot more downward pressure on finding a way to make that number work. And things like longevity and steps aren't necessarily going to be a given anymore. You can see that the non-economic items haven't changed because they haven't been negotiated yet. So we're going to go a step further and we're going to negotiate an ATB raise. So we're talking about 1.75%. And you know, your unions look at you like 1.75%, that's not a raise, my health insurance has gone up, what are you talking about, that doesn't even cover my contributions. Well, when you have your spreadsheets done and you run the numbers quickly, and obviously it's full disclosure, I need to go back and double check my numbers, but taking a look at it as I run the numbers, well, 1.75% is effectively 4.63% on your contract. So you're now nearly going to budget 5% more this upcoming year for your contracts when I've only negotiated 1.75%, right? Like, how many times do you hear that? The other reason it's important to have such a functional spreadsheet that I experienced was sometimes we actually had the state present at our negotiations because they wouldn't allow us to negotiate more than the 2% cap unless we got significant givebacks from our unions. So having these spreadsheets in place, when the negotiations got intense, but you felt like you were getting somewhere and you kind of wanted to make a decision at that moment, it's obviously subject to the governing body accepting it. But when you're there and you're saying, well, if you can get this done, then we'll leave here today and we'll have a deal, you can be comfortable with that decision because your spreadsheet is smart enough to give you that warm and fuzzy feeling that you can pay for it next year. And it's not like, well, it's 1.75%, I wonder if it's 3%, 2.5%, 4%, 5% on my contract. So you kind of become the hired gun during negotiations, whether you're at the table or whether you're sitting behind the negotiating team and you're whispering things in their ears. Sometimes they shush you and they shouldn't because really it comes down to whether or not you can pay for it, but it's good to know. So this is basically a recap of what I just told you, right? It's only 1.75%, but it's not. We all know that even before you negotiated that ATB raise, dynamic status quo had you at 2.83%. You were blowing through the arbitration cap, the 2%. You were already over the 2% that you have that's limiting that line item in your budget pretty much. And then small things like increasing a detective stipend or increasing your clothing allowance overall was 4.7% on the budget. So it's not always dollars and cents. Qualitative issues are very important. And sometimes when you have qualitative issues, you have to shift your analysis. So our unions negotiated a Pittman schedule for the police department. And it was significant because they went from a 10-hour day to a 12-hour day. It was a 20% increase in their workday. And there are a lot of other factors that go into it. And at that point, you might look at an effective percentage increase and go, wow, that's big. But you need to switch your analysis to an hourly rate. And I'm not talking about like what your straight time rate is based on how you calculate it in your contracts to figure out your overtime. How many hours do they work in a year now? And what is their salary versus what is the negotiated number of hours, less Kelly days or any of those other things that you put in there, divided by their new salary. And what you'll see is sometimes you're actually negotiating a relatively close number. So you've had a very successful negotiation because your straight time rate is almost nearly the same thing, even though you've had a big effective percentage increase on the contract. And now you have more boots on the ground. And now you have something else that you can give to your governing body and to your public that you've received for that bigger raise or that bigger increase on the contract. When you prepare your spreadsheets properly, you've done a lot of things. You've already prepared your EC forms, and you've already worked towards your budget projections. You've broken everything down by your base salary costs. You've broken down your longevity and other base year costs. And then they want everything broken down by year. So if you're negotiating 3 years, the way the proposed forms are right now, they want to know what's your longevity in your base year, what is it in year 1, year 2, year 3, what's the incremental difference, what's the percentage change. Your budget projections, it's not just for salary and wage line items. When you cost out your contracts like this and when you create a scattergram for your departments, you're actually planning long-term around what your department looks like. That's important for things like new hires and retirements and attrition, but it also can set the tone for the way that you negotiate. So if you see that a majority of your union is actually older and closer to retirement, then you can start using that as leverage. You might want to sweeten the deal a little bit because they're going to be more willing to make changes for new hires. And the changes for new hires are where you're going to be able to start to really mold your budget going forward, right? You're going to have some of these higher paid police officers or firemen or any union that you're dealing with leave within the next 2 to 3 years. So you might be willing to pay a little more to know that now your salary guide is going to be 12 steps instead of 8 steps. Because now it's going to take you 12 years to get to max pay instead of 8 years. Or eliminate longevity, which is a huge, huge win for negotiations because you're no longer dealing with these compounding numbers on top of base salary. You also want to smooth out increases. I know in our negotiations we had a huge jump from an 8-step patrol officer to a sergeant, and then a little jump between sergeant and lieutenant. But we had so many sergeants, right? So we were able to work, there were 2 separate unions. One was the superiors and one was the patrol. So we were able to work with the superiors because everybody was either a current sergeant or lieutenant to increase their wages a little bit and create the gap between sergeant and lieutenants. But then they weren't necessarily representing the patrol, so we were able to lower oncoming sergeants, what their max pay would be, and we were able to bring in new steps for them. And that was a huge win for our budget going forward. Sorry. Okay, so you're probably tired of hearing me talk already, but there is a little bit more. Your pensions. So this is another economic factor that often isn't quantified in negotiations, and this one is not required by arbitration, and it's not even required by your EC forms, but it is a huge number. We contribute 27%. We, the taxpayers, contribute 27% on every dollar that's an increased salary that is pensionable. And that is a huge number. When you're in the private sector and you're negotiating your contract, you better believe that your employer's contribution to your 401k is a big factor. So it's not something that should be taken for granted. You should figure out those numbers. And when you're in those meetings, you should make it clear to the unions that for every $100,000 that you're negotiating, in 2 years, I'm going to get a $27,000 bill for it. What they're putting into their pension is equally expensive, but it's also going to be something that's returned to them in the future. And full disclosure, I have nothing against police or firemen. I think they do an amazing job. My husband's a police officer, so I want him to have a long career, and I want him to have a career where everything he signed up for is still there when he retires. And so that's where I come from. Health insurance, your Chapter 78 contributions are on your EC forms. You need to know how that's going to change. And even though it's not a factor in arbitration, I think it's a factor in negotiations because, again, if you know that you have an older department, majority of your personnel are already earning over $100,000, their contributions aren't changing. They're already at max. But if you have a very young department and they're bumping up on steps and longevity, chances are you're going to get a bump in your contribution for health insurance. Now, you're not going to want to lower your health insurance line item by that because that isn't the best budgeting technique. But if you know you're going to have a small windfall of cash, maybe you can fund that project that your mayor's been wanting to do without having to fluctuate your budget. And you can plan for it because you know you're going to have that one-shot revenue that year that you can use to subsidize it. So those become some of the little tricks and the things that we kind of keep in our back pocket that then we know which line items to pick from in order to get certain projects done during the year. So I have talked about, implementation date. This is such an important one, and Mary actually reminded me of this before I came in. So my biggest pet peeve is retros. I hate them. I hate calculating them. I hate everything about them. I get goosebumps when I think about them. They used to be reported on this super long spreadsheet where you couldn't tab from one quarter to the next. And now they're on the state's website, but they only give you 6 lines. So anyone who has multiple steps in longevity, you have to email them again, and you have to tell them, this person doesn't fit, send me it's a nightmare. So in negotiations, every time the R word came up, like steam came out of my ears. So get creative. Award an increase for the prior year, but agree that there's no retro pay. It's a way of saying that, okay, so we had a 1%, 1%, 1% contract instead of saying that it's just 2% loaded in this year. And you start that new salary at the beginning of this year, you might have to pay 1 or 2 months of retro, but it's not as bad as paying several years of retro. Or another one is, do you want your money up front? Is it important to you to get these retros fast? Well, then how about we agree that you don't get retro on overtime and you just get retro on your salary? because that makes my life easier and it puts the money in your pocket sooner. So these are some of the things that you can be flexible with and that you're obviously much more sensitive to because you're doing the work. I'm done. No, I'm not. I still have a few more things. So you've done all the work, you've negotiated your contracts, you think that you're done, but you know that you're not because now there's this whole back-end piece to it, right? It doesn't matter how long you've had your contracts. If you've been in a municipality for years or if you're new to the municipality, you need to read your contracts and then read them and then reread them again. Familiarity can lead to error. You think that you're doing something right because you've been doing it so long, and then all of a sudden you realize that it's not right. So you need to really get comfortable with your contracts. Terms from one contract to the next can be overlooked. I can't stress this enough. Whether or not you're in the room, attorneys have a whole different way of doing things and thinking about things, and they have this gray space that they live in that we as CFOs don't. We want things to be black and white. So as soon as negotiations are done, pin them down, go through the MOUs or MOAs that they have compiled, and go through each line item and find out what was their intention with this new negotiated term. Because chances are 6, 7, 8 months down the line, they're going to be scratching their heads like, oh, you know, I don't really remember, I don't know. Get familiar with the changes while they're fresh in their minds. We all have a lot of things going on, so you want to be comfortable with what changed in the contract early on, and you want to understand it. And at the end of the day, we're all managers, and if we want our staff to do the right thing for us, we need to take the time to filter the information to them correctly. You need to sit down with your payroll department and explain to them what's changed in the contract, what do you need to look forward, what you need to look for when you're implementing the payroll. If you're changing the way overtime is administered, you want to make sure that you talk to the clerk or the person that's involved with the administration of that union's time so that they know what they have to change and what they have to implement. I mean, how many times have you heard, oh, what do you mean you weren't doing this? Well, I'm the last to know. Nobody explains anything to me. Nobody talks to me about anything. So you have that responsibility as managers to really talk to the stakeholders within your municipality so that they make your job easier by you teaching them how to do their job and so that they do it right. Finally, I just put some resources up here. The spreadsheets, or the PowerPoint's going to be available. And what I did was I put a couple links up here. The task force reports that were implemented after the 2% cap are great. The comparisons and the information that they provided, the settlements from other municipalities, it's really informative. So if you get a chance, take a look through those. I've also included the most recent decisions that were related to dynamic status quo. And I think that's really interesting to follow because in situations like what I talked about earlier with Bridgewater and Atlantic County, PERC is still kind of up in the air because the Supreme Court ruled on a contract issue, not necessarily on the PERC issue of dynamic status quo. And then the last one that is extremely relevant that everybody should really take a look at, and I want to talk about again for 1 minute. So the proposed rules that came out with the new ECDF forms, there was a group of great organizations, the League of Municipalities, GFOA, and a couple of others, that put together a response to that, and it was a great response. And basically what it said was, when this law came into effect, the requirement to have budgets online and the requirement to have user-friendly budgets and all these other transparency-related documents didn't exist. So the response was, this is another layer of work for CFOs to sign off on, to certify to submit to the public. I don't know if they look at them, and it's a great response, and I hope that it goes somewhere, but I think that EC forms are here to stay because I think that they're an attempt to extend this culture of understanding how much CNAs are really costing municipalities, and they want the governing body to be aware of the decisions they're making, and they want the public to know what it is that's going on and what it is that's ultimately impacting the bottom line. And I don't know about you, but when I talk about a 5% increase on my budget rather than a 1.75% ATB, it's a big difference, and you start to get a little bit more steam from your governing body to help contain those numbers when they know how big they really are. So, you know, I want to thank you for your time, and I don't know if we have any time for questions or not, but if you have any,
yes,
if not,
we do have another 10 minutes. Does anyone have questions?
Or if everyone's ready to hot tail it out of here, have a good weekend. So, oh, okay.
Thank you. Great presentation,
Oh,
Gabriella.
thank you.
In the negotiations for the last contract that you did you discuss eliminating longevity? What were the discussions?
We did. So another really fun thing that I had happen to me, amongst all of those other things I mentioned, was the Office of the State Comptroller came into Harrison. And they decided that they were going to do a pilot audit. And it lasted from 2011, I was engaged. They were there while I got married. They were there while I got pregnant. They were there after I had my first child. And they issued a report in 2014. And one of the things, or basically the headline of the report was, there are too many perks for these contracts, right? And I mean, that's great. They were in their contracts. We had to get them out. It's not that there was anything we could do about it. But the point is that report really helped serve as leverage when we negotiated. And so we did. Our unions were willing to negotiate a way for our police department longevity for new hires after a certain date, and for our fire union, they eliminated or they reduced their longevity significantly. We used to have a scale that went from 2% to 14%, and for new hires, it actually only goes up to 6%. So they were willing to get rid of it for new hires, and their main argument was, we want people to know what they're signing up for. And I agree with that. And I also think it's an advantage because in the future, when the younger generation of the unions are negotiating, they know what they're actually negotiating, and they're negotiating for the full union, not for just the guys that happen to be on steps or happen to be getting longevity that year. It's for everybody. So it becomes more of a group effort, and everyone is affected by it. So we were able to negotiate it away, and it is for new hires, which means we're not going to feel the benefits until a couple of years from now, or a long time from now. But at least now, we know that there's something in place to help curb expenses. And so, yeah, we were successful in doing that.
Do you know if there's any information on how many towns have either bought out longevity or
I'm not sure.
negotiated for the future? But I'm just wondering maybe if we could do a...
Oh, it is.
It is a question, but
it just
what's
started.
the answer? I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's another reason that these EC forms are coming out. But again, they're to be filed with your governing body, not with the division. And just another quick note, on the EC forms, there's a qualitative section. And it's important to put notes in there because what does it matter what my police budget is against my neighboring town's police budget if they have 1,000 police officers and I have 30? There's no indication on there of how many budgeted positions you have. So there's no way of figuring out, well, I'm Harrison and this is Kearney. What's the average cost per officer in my neighboring town? So put that qualitative information in there if it gives your taxpayer perspective. If at the end of the day, you negotiated a higher raise, but you have some of the lowest paid officers and you're trying to be competitive with your towns, give that information. It's a good reason for you to negotiate what you can afford.
I'm just curious here, how many CFOs have negotiated out longevity in the past 5 years?
Big trend.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions? So at this time, I want to thank Gabriella. Great presentation.